What do you do with tens of thousands of tanks, millions of rifles, and hangars full of jets the moment a war ends? Do you melt them down and erase a painful chapter? Or do you keep them, study them, and in some cases, hand them to new owners? After 1945, the Allies faced a brutal, practical question. German weapons were valuable, useful, and sometimes dangerously advanced. Destroying everything was an option. So was preserving, repurposing, and redistributing. The choice they made, often pragmatic, sometimes hurried, and occasionally morally fraught, meant that Germany's war machines did not simply vanish in 1945. They found new lives in deserts, on foreign runways, and in countless skirmishes and wars that followed. In the weeks and months after VE Day, Allied depots filled. Rows of Panzer IVs and Panthers sat idle in French yards. Luftwaffe fighters, Bf-109s, Fw-190s, mothballed in hangars. Crates of MP-40 submachine guns and Mauser rifles stacked in warehouses. The immediate problem was logistical and strategic at once. Scrapping everything would consume fuel, labor, and time at a moment when Europe needed reconstruction. Storing equipment was expensive, yet those metal hulks and blueprints contained intelligence value, insights into engineering, materials, and tactics that the victors wanted to study. And above all, the Cold War was already shadowing the horizon. Western and Soviet planners saw German know-how as a shortcut to future power. Allied policy toward German hardware was not monolithic. In some theaters, destruction happened rapidly, especially where denazification or safety concerns demanded it. Elsewhere, the calculus favored reuse. Captured weapons could be refurbished for friendly states, offered to new governments, or parceled out to allies when post-war shortages made that attractive. Records show a pattern. Where material shortages, intelligence gains, or geopolitical advantage existed, preservation won out. This pragmatic approach set the stage for long tales of influence the Allies may not have fully anticipated. If you follow the trail of armored vehicles, the story becomes both technical and oddly poetic. Many German armored vehicles were not stripped for scrap but rebuilt. Mechanics at Allied yards stripped engines, repaired tracks, rewired electrical systems, and adapted cooling systems to cope with different climates. In North Africa and the Middle East, tanks designed for temperate European fields needed changes for sand and heat. Air intakes altered, dust filters installed, and radios reworked to work with local systems. Panzer IVs, medium tanks intended for mid-war operations, were among the most widely refurbished. The Sturmgeschütz III, an assault gun built on a Panzer chassis, also found second lives once crews learned to maintain their quirks. These machines were shipped, sold, or otherwise transferred to a number of recipients. Egypt and Syria acquired second-hand German armor, sometimes supplemented with spare parts and manuals. In the Suez Crisis of 1956, Egyptian forces fielded Panzer IVs that, in essence, were descendants of the same vehicles that had fought in Europe a decade earlier. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, encounters between former allies and ex-Axis hardware produced grim ironies. Tanks with German serial numbers facing off against modern Western and Soviet-built vehicles in disputed deserts and hills. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War again saw refurbished and modified German-origin armor on battlefields where their initial designers could hardly have imagined they'd fight. Not every transfer was direct or well documented. Yugoslavia, for example, assimilated German tanks into its post-war arsenal and kept some in reserves for decades. Those vehicles later surfaced during the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s, sometimes in surprising numbers. Spain, under Franco, also integrated German designs and parts into its armored core in the late 1940s and 1950s, a reflection of how political alignments and material scarcity made reuse a practical choice. The upshot: tanks built for one ideological conflict found themselves pressed into service in entirely different contexts. Regional disputes, decolonization wars, and civil conflicts, decades after 1945. Aircraft presented a different set of dilemmas. Jets like the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, were technical marvels that demanded careful study. Allied engineers disassembled examples, test flew captured airframes when possible, and copied lessons in jet propulsion, aerodynamics, and construction. The Me-262 did not translate directly into an Allied production model, but its existence accelerated understanding of what a jet age could be and forced designers to adapt. Soviet engineers had similar opportunities. Operation Osoaviakhim and other Soviet programs ensured Moscow's technical cadres could examine and learn from German aviation achievements. At the same time, a number of piston engine fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, slid into odd peacetime careers. Aircraft that once chased Allied bombers later found their way into civilian hands. Some were purchased by private collectors or governments and converted for display or training. In Argentina and elsewhere, former Luftwaffe pilots and technicians helped transfer knowledge, sometimes operating or maintaining these machines. In the United States and Western Europe, meticulously restored Bf-109s and Fw-190s began to appear in air shows, where veterans watched with conflicted emotions as machines that once symbolized a brutal war looped the sky as crowd-pleasing attractions. For some, these flights were purely technical admiration. For others, they were reminders of loss. Either way, captured aircraft served as both tools for learning and odd trophies of a conflict that refused to end cleanly. Small arms probably had the most widespread and long-lasting diffusion. Rifle and submachine gun calibers did not expire with surrender papers. Mauser 98K bolt-action rifles, MP40 submachine guns, and the Sturmgewehr 44, all present in enormous quantities at war's end, slipped into new flows of weapons. Some were sold through legal channels or captured and redistributed by occupying forces. Others entered black markets or were appropriated by emerging states and insurgent groups. Records indicate that millions of small arms and round counts existed in European depots. While precise shipment figures are often estimates, the pattern is clear. These weapons spread far and wide. The STG-44, the Sturmgewehr, warrants particular attention. It embodied a new concept, a select-fire, intermediate cartridge rifle that bridged the gap between submachine gun and full-power bolt-action rifle. Its design elements, shorter barrel, detachable magazine, controlled automatic fire, helped formalize what would become the modern assault rifle concept. Historians and weapons designers note that the STG-44 influenced later developments. The AK-47, developed in the Soviet Union, drew on a range of inputs, and while the AK was not a direct copy of these G-44, the German weapon's existence made the assault rifle idea more tangible and demonstrated practical advantages that designers around the world studied. That influence, technical and conceptual, rippled outward. When you see assault rifles in conflicts from Korea to Syria, part of that lineage can be traced back to innovations first popularized in late-war Germany. Those rifles and submachine guns found their way into Korea in the early 1950s, into various anti-colonial struggles in Africa and Asia, into South American guerrilla arsenals, and much later into the complex web of arms in the Middle East. The Syrian Civil War, for example, revealed a tangle of equipment types, some dating back decades, and investigators have documented German-origin weapons among those flows. Again, where precise provenance is murky, historians flag uncertainty, but the broad pattern of diffusion and reuse is supported by archival records and battlefield archaeology. Behind the metal and wood of weapons lay another arena of transfer: people. Scientists, engineers, rocket technicians, and aeronautical experts became prizes in a different kind of competition. In the United States, Operation Paperclip recruited dozens of German specialists, among them engineers who had worked on rockets and jet engines, to American research programs. Werner von Braun is the most famous of these figures. His work at Peenemünde before and during the war translated into leadership roles in the U.S. rocket program and, eventually, NASA's Saturn V development. In the Soviet zone, Operation Osoaviakhim and other Soviet initiatives moved entire teams of German specialists eastward, where they contributed to Soviet missile and aviation projects. These movements accelerated early Cold War technological competition. The prize was not merely prestige but decisive strategic capability. Rockets, missiles, and jet technology would underwrite deterrence and influence in the decades to come. But ethical questions followed. Recruiting experts who had worked under the Nazi regime raised uncomfortable moral dilemmas: how to balance the urgent security needs of a nascent Cold War against responsibility for past complicity. Governments defended pragmatic choices with security rationales. Critics pointed to moral compromises and argued for accountability. Historians continue to debate these trade-offs. Some emphasize the technical gains and their role in creating the space age. Others insist that moral reckoning was shortchanged by geopolitical urgency. Putting these strands together clarifies the answer to the title question. The Allies often did not destroy German weapons because those weapons were useful. They were sources of intelligence, stopgaps for shortages, and commodities in a rapidly shifting geopolitical market. They allowed industrial and military planners to learn, to rearm allies, and to accelerate their own programs without reinventing every wheel. The Cold War, arriving almost overnight, made such expedient choices even more understandable. Western and Soviet powers alike wanted to outbuild and outlearn each other, and German technology was a shortcut. That practical logic, however, came with consequences. Reused German armor shaped mid- and late 20th century battles from the Sinai to the Golan Heights. Refurbished aircraft seeded knowledge that helped jumpstart jet aviation programs across continents. The spread of small arms fed insurgencies and state armies alike, often prolonging violence in places far from Europe's ruined factories. Recruiting German scientists sped technological advances but raised questions about justice, memory, and the price of security. The picture is not a single conspiratorial narrative. It is a mosaic of decisions, each taken under pressure, each with its own local context. In some cases, destruction was chosen. In others, preservation. Sometimes weapons were handed to allies under explicit programs. Sometimes they leaked through black markets and chaotic bureaucracies. Where causal links are plausible, such as the STG-44 informing later assault rifle designs, scholars allow for influence rather than direct unbroken lineage. Where details remain contested, official records and later scholarship offer estimates and interpretations rather than neat certainties. Consider a few close-up moments that capture the ambiguity. A mechanic in an Egyptian workshop in the late 1950s replacing a worn Panzer IV engine to keep an old hull running for training exercises. A former Luftwaffe pilot in Germany watching a restored Bf-109 perform at a U.S. airshow in the 1960s and feeling both pride in engineering and the guilt of what it had been used for. An American engineer in the 1940s poring over Me-262 blueprints, trying to extract lessons that might shave years off his country's own jet development. Each scene shows utility and dissonance combined. If the Allies had destroyed every German weapon, post-war militaries and defense industries would have faced longer, costlier paths to modernization. That might have altered the pace of early Cold War competition. But destruction also would have been a clearer moral statement, an attempt to sever a technological thread from a criminal regime. In practice, policymakers favored a mixed approach. Destroy where necessary, preserve where strategic value or practical need outweighed other considerations. The long shadow of these decisions endures. Weapons outlive politics. A tank built for blitzkrieg can end up defending a border in North Africa. A rifle stamped with wartime markings can fire in a civil war half a century later. Design ideas born of desperation can be absorbed and transformed into instruments that shape entire military doctrines. The post-war fate of German weapons is a study in pragmatism, with all its technical gains and moral compromises. If this kind of deep dive into WWE's hidden legacies interests you, hit like and subscribe. There are more stories about the afterlives of war, how technology, people, and ideas move from the battlefield into the wider world. In the end, the simple answer to what happened to the German weapons that the Allies didn't want destroyed is this: they were kept, examined, repurposed, and spread. Some were recycled into new armies. Some became templates for new technologies. Others entered markets and conflicts far from their origins. Those choices helped shape the Cold War balance, fed later regional wars, and left an ambiguous legacy: technical progress shadowed by ethical compromise. The war machines of 1945 did not disappear. They were refitted, reassigned, and, in many cases, continued to influence the course of history long after the guns fell silent. Subscribe for more history deep dives, and check out our related video on what happened to German generals after World War II for the next chapter of this story.